Picture Rome in 80 CE. The city hummed with ambition, and at its heart rose something extraordinary, an amphitheatre so massive it would define architectural achievement for millennia. The structure we now call the Colosseum wasn't yet a ruin. It stood complete, gleaming with marble facades that caught the Mediterranean sun and nearly blinded onlookers. The Romans themselves rarely used its formal name, the Flavian Amphitheatre. That designation honored the imperial dynasty that commissioned it, but locals simply gestured toward the colossal statue of Nero that loomed nearby and called the building the Colosseum. The nickname stuck, outlasting emperors, gladiators, and eventually the structure's own integrity. Architectural ambition radiated from every detail. 80 archways welcomed crowds, while 50,000 spectators could fill the tiered seating. Engineering marvels hid beneath the visible grandeur, concrete vaults stacked with mathematical precision, iron fastenings binding each stone, and underground chambers where elaborate machinery operated. Slaves worked hidden elevators, launching wild animals into the arena as if summoned by magic. The opening ceremonies stretched across 100 consecutive days. Emperor Titus orchestrated spectacles that pushed imagination's boundaries. Gladiatorial combat formed just one element of the entertainment buffet. Exotic beasts from distant provinces fought and died by the hundreds. In a feat of hydraulic engineering that staggers modern observers, the Romans flooded the arena floor and staged naval battles, full-scale ship combat recreated indoors. Social hierarchy embedded itself in the seating arrangements. Senators occupied prime positions near the action, while common citizens scrambled for upper-tier spots. Yet everyone shared the same visceral experience: the clash of weapons, the roar of beasts, the metallic scent of blood mixing with sweat and dust. This wasn't mere entertainment. The Colosseum functioned as political theatre, a massive propaganda tool. Emperors demonstrated Rome's wealth and power while literally feeding the masses. Bread and circuses kept populations content, or at least distracted from political grievances. Every spectacular death reinforced the message. Rome commanded resources beyond imagination and wielded absolute authority over life itself. The arena of death. For centuries following that grand opening, the Colosseum operated as Rome's premier venue for state-sanctioned killing. Modern sensibilities recoil, but Romans viewed these spectacles as essential civic events. Missing a major show meant missing the cultural conversation. Gladiators formed the main attraction, though Hollywood's portrayal requires correction. Not every fighter arrived as a slave. Some were volunteers, professional combatants, who chose this dangerous career path. Victory could bring fame, fortune, and eventually freedom. Defeat meant becoming compost for the arena floor, but the gambling man might calculate odds worth taking. The animal spectacles matched the gladiatorial bouts in scale and brutality. Procurement agents scoured the empire's edges, capturing lions from African plains, bears from alpine forests, crocodiles from Egyptian rivers. These creatures endured brutal transportation, weeks confined in cages, deprived of food and water, deliberately maddened before their final appearance. Ostriches met particularly absurd ends. Imagine the scene: a large bird sprinting in confusion while spectators roared approval at its eventual spearing. The senselessness amplified the spectacle's core message. Rome's power extended even to making mockery of nature itself. Historical reenactments provided yet another entertainment category. Prisoners of war found themselves costumed and armed, then forced to recreate Rome's military victories. The scripts always ended the same way, with the prisoners' deaths serving as living, then dying, propaganda. Theatrical execution, essentially, where actors played their roles once and never took a bow. Conservative estimates suggest hundreds of thousands perished within those walls across the centuries. The precise count vanished with history, but the magnitude remains undeniable. Human and animal bodies accumulated in underground chambers before disposal. The Colosseum consumed life with industrial efficiency, all while crowds cheered and vendors sold refreshments. Later generations whispered about hauntings and credibility strains not to believe them. If any location should echo with restless spirits, surely it's a building where death formed the daily business model. Blood soaked into stone for so many centuries that the structure itself seemed stained beyond cleaning. Yet architecturally, the building endured this relentless violence without apparent damage. Stone arches supported their loads. Concrete foundations remained solid. The structure outlasted its original purpose by centuries, proving Roman engineering could survive even Rome's own bloodlust. The slow decline. The Colosseum's operational era didn't end dramatically. It faded, much like the empire itself. By the 5th century, Rome faced existential crises that made funding lion imports seem frivolous. Barbarian invasions multiplied. Political assassination became routine. The treasury held more dust than gold. Gladiatorial combat officially ended around 404 CE, when the last recorded match occurred. Christianity's growing influence contributed to this shift. Church leaders questioned how followers could claim moral authority while cheering for executions. The contradiction grew too stark to ignore. Animal hunts continued sporadically, but the golden age had passed. The elaborate spectacles that once defined Roman culture now seemed like expensive nostalgia. Emperors had more pressing concerns than entertaining restless crowds. The Western Empire was imploding, and no amount of arena spectacle could shore up the crumbling foundations. When Visigoths sacked Rome in 410, they bypassed the Colosseum entirely. Why bother? The building no longer represented power, just an empty reminder of faded glory. The structure stood silent as the world transformed around it, a monument to an era that had exhausted itself through excess. Medieval Romans gradually developed selective amnesia about the building's purpose. The Colosseum transitioned from active venue to passive landmark, that massive old thing that nobody quite knew what to do with. Its stones remained intact, but its cultural relevance deteriorated faster than its physical structure. This neglect marked just the beginning of a long transformation. The Colosseum would soon discover that surviving its operational years was the easy part. The real challenges began when Rome stopped caring. Nature's assault. While human interest waned, geological forces prepared their attack. The Colosseum had withstood centuries of human violence, but earthquakes proved far more destructive than gladiators. In 847 CE, a significant tremor struck Rome. The southern section of the Colosseum, built on less stable ground, absorbed the worst impact. Massive stone blocks tumbled downward in a catastrophic cascade. What emperors couldn't destroy through neglect, the earth accomplished in minutes. Roman engineers had designed brilliantly, but even genius can't override basic geology. The northern half clung to more stable foundations and survived relatively intact. The southern portion suffered progressive collapse, creating the asymmetrical appearance that defines the ruin today. These seismic events repeated throughout the medieval period. Each tremor loosened more stones, creating what locals saw not as tragedy, but as opportunity. Huge travertine blocks lay scattered and accessible, free building materials delivered by natural disaster. Medieval pragmatism kicked in immediately. The earthquake of 1349 delivered the final devastating blow. This quake possessed enough force to collapse remaining sections of the southern walls and seating areas. Stone arches that had stood for over a millennium simply folded. The Colosseum's silhouette changed forever. from circular amphitheatre to permanent half-ruin. Ironically, this destruction sealed the building's survival. The collapsed sections couldn't be looted as easily as standing structures. Massive broken blocks proved harder to move than intact architectural elements. Nature's violence inadvertently created a preservation effect. What remained standing was inevitably cannibalized, but the rubble endured through sheer unwieldiness. Modern visitors see this earthquake damage as the primary cause of the Colosseum's missing sections. And they're partially correct, but earthquakes only initiated the destruction. Human activity would finish what geology started. The human scavengers, medieval Romans, looked at earthquake rubble and saw construction supplies. The Colosseum transformed from monument into quarry, and this shift spelled doom for its structural integrity. Logic dictated this exploitation. Why expend energy extracting and transporting stone from distant quarries when pre-cut travertine blocks lay scattered throughout the city centre? The finest building material in Italy sat waiting, free for the taking. Only stubbornness would refuse such convenience. Noble families rushed to claim their shares, palaces required stone, and Colosseum marble offered both quality and cost savings. The Frangipani family went further, actually fortifying parts of the structure and moving in. They converted a section of the ancient arena into a medieval fortress, practical reuse taken to its logical extreme. The Catholic Church participated enthusiastically in this architectural cannibalism. St. Peter's Basilica boasts considerable amounts of Colosseum stone, though official histories avoid advertising this fact. Popes authorized the removal of marble and travertine to beautify churches and papal buildings. They justified this by designating the Colosseum a site of Christian martyrdom, though historical accuracy of such claims remains debatable. The transformation accelerated. What began as salvaging earthquake debris evolved into systematic dismantling. People actively pried stones from still-standing sections. The metal clamps binding blocks together became particularly valuable. Iron commanded high prices, and thousands of clamps held the Colosseum together. Extracting them required damaging surrounding stone, but medieval scavengers considered this acceptable collateral damage. Holes left by clamp extraction still scar the Colosseum's walls. These pockmarks create a textured surface that tourists might mistake for age-related erosion. Actually, they're evidence of systematic theft. Someone's ancestor needed iron and didn't care about preserving monuments. By the late Middle Ages, calling it a Colosseum seemed generous. Stone warehouse might be more accurate. The building bled into the surrounding city, its substance scattered across fountains, palace walls, church facades, and private homes. Rome hadn't lost its monument, it had simply redistributed it. Domestic transformations. The Colosseum's identity crisis continued. Having served as murder stadium and building supply depot, it next became residential and commercial real estate. Medieval Romans inhabited the ancient arches, converting them into workshops, shops, and living spaces. Ground-level archways offered weather protection and prime locations. Blacksmiths set up forges where once crowds had surged. Bakers installed ovens in spaces that had channeled spectators. Butchers displayed meat under arches, stained with centuries-old bloodstains, unintentional continuity with the building's violent past. Families carved out dwellings in the Colosseum's remains. Living inside history's most famous arena meant accepting certain inconveniences. Rain leaked through broken roofs. Sections occasionally collapsed without warning, but rent was free and location mattered. The building provided shelter while its reputation deterred some criminal activity. Even thieves found the place slightly haunted. Workshops multiplied within the structure. Carpenters, tanners, and metalworkers all claimed spaces. The Colosseum hummed with commercial activity. tools clanging where gladiators had once fought. The contrast would have astonished ancient Romans, but medieval inhabitants saw only practical space utilization. Travelers visiting Rome during this period reported surreal scenes. Instead of experiencing a majestic ruin, they encountered a half-collapsed building teeming with commerce and domesticity. Smoke rose from cooking fires lodged in ancient walls. Children chased chickens across the arena floor. The Colosseum had become a vertical village, its historical significance buried beneath immediate human needs. This transformation wasn't seen as desecration. Medieval culture didn't prioritize preservation the way modern societies do. Buildings served practical purposes. When original functions became obsolete, new purposes emerged. The Colosseum adapted to serve changing needs, even if those needs bore no resemblance to imperial spectacles. Pastoral interlude. The Colosseum's career trajectory took another unexpected turn. It became grazing land. The arena that once hosted naval battles and gladiatorial combat devolved into a pasture for livestock. Vegetation claimed the abandoned spaces. Seeds carried by wind, birds, and animal fur found purchase in cracks and crevices. Grass carpeted the arena floor. Weeds flourished in the seating tiers. The structure gradually transformed into an overgrown meadow that happened to be surrounded by ancient architecture. Shepherds recognized opportunity. Free grazing land in central Rome, goats and sheep needed no convincing. Herds wandered freely through the Colosseum, munching grass where thousands had once screamed for blood. The scene carried profound irony. Rome's symbol of imperial violence had become peacefully pastoral. This agricultural use seemed perfectly natural to medieval inhabitants. Ruins weren't sacred or untouchable, they were resources. The Colosseum could serve as fortress, quarry, shopping center, or pasture depending on current needs. Flexibility trumped sentimentality. Foreign visitors found this transformation both shocking and hilarious. They arrived expecting to see the legendary amphitheater and instead encountered sheep grazing amid crumbling walls. One chronicler noted the scene resembled a village green more than an ancient wonder. The commentary dripped with barely concealed embarrassment at Rome's reduced circumstances. Botanists later documented hundreds of plant species growing throughout the ruin. Many were exotic varieties whose seeds had arrived centuries earlier, carried by the very animals slaughtered for entertainment. The Colosseum had inadvertently become an international botanical garden, preserving plant species from across the ancient empire. Nature's reclamation accelerated structural decay. Tree roots pried stones apart, grass concealed hazards. Yet this same vegetation also helped stabilize certain sections, holding rubble in place and preventing further collapse. The Colosseum became an ecosystem, supporting life in ways its builders never imagined. Sacred and cursed, medieval Romans struggled with how to interpret the Colosseum. Its pagan origins and violent history complicated Christian society's relationship with the structure. The solution? Declare it both sacred and cursed simultaneously. Christian tradition held that countless martyrs had died in the arena, executed for refusing to worship Roman gods. Historical evidence for mass Christian executions, specifically in the Colosseum, remains thin, but the story satisfied narrative needs. The building could be reframed as holy ground, a site of sacrifice that deserved reverence rather than destruction. Popes promoted this interpretation strategically. Discouraging further dismantling required giving people reasons to preserve rather than plunder. Declaring the Colosseum a shrine to Christian martyrs provided that justification. Pilgrimages began, prayers were offered, the building acquired protective status, at least theoretically. Simultaneously, supernatural rumors multiplied. Locals whispered that the Colosseum was haunted. Given the hundreds of thousands who died violently within its walls, skepticism about such claims requires more imagination than belief. Strange noises echoed at night. Cold winds blew through the arches. People reported seeing shadows and hearing voices. This dual identity, sacred site and spooky ruin, created fascinating contradictions. By day, pilgrims visited to honor martyrs. By night, locals avoided the area entirely, convinced that restless spirits roamed the corridors. The Colosseum existed in perpetual twilight between holy ground and cursed location. The building's reputation helped ensure partial preservation. Yes, people still stole stones. Yes, the structure continued deteriorating, but the pace slowed. Complete demolition became unthinkable. The Colosseum had acquired cultural meanings that transcended its practical value as a building supply source. Renaissance recognition. When Renaissance scholars turned attention toward classical antiquity, the Colosseum gained new significance. Instead of seeing a convenient stone quarry or haunted ruin, humanists recognized architectural genius and historical importance. Documentation efforts began. Artists sketched the remaining structures. Scholars studied ancient texts describing the building's original appearance. Questions emerged. How had such monuments been constructed? What engineering knowledge had been lost? Could modern builders replicate such achievements? The answer to that final question was humbling. No, they couldn't. Renaissance architecture drew inspiration from classical models, but couldn't match Roman engineering. The Colosseum stood as proof that technological knowledge could actually decline over centuries. Progress wasn't inevitable. This realization sparked genuine preservation efforts. Popes issued orders protecting the structure from further dismantling. These orders were imperfectly enforced, but they marked a philosophical shift. The Colosseum had value beyond its building materials. It was a teacher demonstrating ancient wisdom that modernity had lost. Botanical interest also flourished during this period. Scholars catalogued the diverse plant species growing throughout the ruins. Many were exotic imports, living connections to the ancient empire's vast reach. The Colosseum had become an accidental botanical archive, preserving specimens from disappeared ecosystems. Yet, protection came late. By the Renaissance, the Colosseum was already irreparably damaged. Earthquakes had toppled major sections. Centuries of looting had stripped away most movable materials. The building stood as a magnificent fragment, impressive in its brokenness but forever incomplete. The irony struck observers even then. Rome had preserved countless lesser buildings while cannibalizing its greatest architectural achievement. The city had devoured its own monument, stone by stone, across centuries of short-sighted pragmatism. The scattered monument. By the 1500s, finding the Colosseum required more than visiting the ancient site. Large portions had migrated across Rome, incorporated into dozens of other structures. The missing half wasn't lost. It was everywhere. St. Peter's Basilica contained substantial Colosseum material in its foundations and walls. The Palazzo Venezia, Palazzo Farnese, and numerous other noble residences all feature travertine blocks from the amphitheatre. Churches, fountains, bridges, Rome's infrastructure incorporated the ancient arena's bones throughout. Walking through Rome meant encountering Colosseum fragments without realizing it. That fountain's marble basin, likely Colosseum origin. The palace's grand staircase, possibly built from arena seating stones. The city had metabolized its monument, breaking it down and reassembling pieces throughout the urban landscape. This dispersal created a peculiar situation. The Colosseum existed both as ruin and as distributed network. It was simultaneously absent and omnipresent, missing from its original location, but embedded throughout the entire city. Rome had become the Colosseum, in a sense. Modern surveys attempt to track where specific stones ended up, though centuries make such investigations difficult. Enough material was removed to build several large churches or multiple palaces. The quantity staggers imagination, thousands of tons of stone redistributed over generations. Some historians argue this dispersal paradoxically honored the Colosseum by giving it continued utility. Rather than standing as an unused monument, its substance served practical purposes. This perspective requires appreciating medieval pragmatism over modern preservation values. Others see only tragedy, a civilization so disconnected from its past that it consumed its greatest architectural achievement without qualm. The loss extends beyond physical material. The complete Colosseum existed briefly, and no living person will ever see it whole. What remains is extraordinary, a massive partial structure that still awes visitors, but it's explicitly incomplete, a permanent reminder that even the mightiest monuments are vulnerable to time, nature, and human short-sightedness. Modern understanding. Contemporary archaeology and conservation have given the Colosseum new life, though not new stone. Stabilization efforts prevent further collapse. Documentation creates detailed records. Tourists pour through by millions annually, generating revenue that funds preservation. We now understand the building's destruction resulted from multiple factors working synergistically. Earthquakes initiated collapse. Human scavenging accelerated dismantling. Vegetation contributed ongoing damage. Neglect allowed preventable deterioration. No single villain destroyed the Colosseum. It was a committee effort spanning centuries. Modern preservation philosophy has evolved considerably. We recognize that monuments embody cultural knowledge and historical identity beyond their practical utility. Letting the Colosseum deteriorate would impoverish human heritage, so we stabilize, study, and protect what remains. Yet this creates interesting paradoxes. The ruin we preserve isn't the building Romans knew. It's a palimpsest, layers of history written, erased, and rewritten. Medieval modifications altered its character. Renaissance protection saved fragments. Modern conservation creates a version of the Colosseum that never historically existed, a carefully maintained ruin. Tourism presents additional complications. Millions of feet where stone's smooth, human touch degrades surfaces. The very attention that funds preservation also accelerates decay. The Colosseum must be shared but also protected from its admirers. Climate change adds new threats. More extreme weather patterns stress ancient structures. Temperature fluctuations expand and contract materials. Rain penetrates cracks more deeply. The Colosseum faces environmental challenges its builders never imagined. Still, the structure endures. It has survived emperors, barbarians, earthquakes, looters, and 14 centuries of neglect. Modern care should ensure survival for centuries more, though in a frozen state, preserved but not growing, maintained but not evolving. The Colosseum story isn't simply about one building. It's about how civilizations treat their past, whether monuments endure or vanish, and what such choices reveal about cultural values. Rome's greatest arena teaches lessons about impermanence, resilience, and the complex relationships between past and present. Part 2. The Roman legion's provisions. Grain as foundation. Roman military might rested on an unglamorous foundation, grain. While swords and shields get historical attention, wheat and barley actually powered conquest. Every legionary carried roughly 3 Roman pounds of grain daily, a burden that ensured survival but taxed already strained backs. This grain ration was non-negotiable. Whether you were a decorated veteran with 20 campaigns behind you or a nervous recruit facing his first battle, the allotment remained identical, equality through grain, an unremarkable yet fundamental aspect of legion life. Converting grain to food required effort that extended the workday considerably. After marching perhaps 30 kilometers while carrying equipment weighing over 30 kilograms, soldiers still faced the tedious task of grinding their wheat. Portable hand mills accompanied each unit, small enough to transport but heavy enough to curse. The grinding process was noisy, dusty, and exhausting. Soldiers would sit after the day's march, shoulders aching, and begin the repetitive motion of crushing kernels into coarse flour. This wasn't punishment, it was survival. Flour meant bread, and bread meant energy for tomorrow's march. Bread itself rarely rose to culinary art. Sometimes it was baked into rough loaves over ember fires, other times it was shaped into flat cakes that cooked quickly on heated stones. On extended campaigns, soldiers baked twice their immediate needs, allowing extra to harden into military hardtack, chewy, dry, nearly flavorless but nearly indestructible. This hardtack could last through forced marches and sieges. It was the taste of discipline made edible, unpleasant but dependable. Warriors learned to soften it with water or vinegar, creating a soggy but consumable mush that filled bellies, if not hearts. Grain's strategic advantage lay in predictability. Unlike livestock requiring pasture or vegetables spoiling quickly, wheat could be stored, transported, and rationed with mathematical precision. Roman supply chains were essentially networks of mule carts loaded with sacks of grain, snaking behind armies across the empire. Generals understood this equation clearly. A hungry legion couldn't fight regardless of training or courage. Julius Caesar himself noted that a commander's primary duty involved keeping soldiers fed. Victory required full stomachs before sharp swords. So when we envision Roman legions, we should picture not just martial displays, but weary men grinding grain after exhausting marches. Their millstones turned survival into empire, one handful of flour at a time. Posca's purpose. If bread fueled Roman bodies, Posca refreshed them, though refreshed requires charitable interpretation. This beverage mixed water with sour wine or diluted vinegar, creating a drink that modern palates would consider punishment. Yet for legionaries, Posca was indispensable. The primary purpose was sanitation. Rivers and wells often carried diseases, especially in enemy territory where hygiene standards varied. Plain water could sicken an entire camp overnight. Vinegar killed many harmful bacteria, making questionable water drinkable. Mixing sour wine with water extended supplies while reducing illness. Posca functioned as ancient Rome's sports drink. Marching 30 kilometers under the Mediterranean sun while carrying heavy equipment required something more stimulating than plain water. The sharp bite of vinegar woke soldiers up more effectively than sweet wine ever could. It was bracing, unpleasant, but precisely what exhausted men needed. The drink also carried cultural significance. Writers recorded instances of generals deliberately choosing Posca over fine wine to demonstrate solidarity with troops. Picture an emperor surrounded by luxury, selecting the soldiers' sour brew instead. This symbolic gesture reinforced leadership by showing shared hardship rather than privileged distance. Soldiers joked about Posca constantly. It was hardly glamorous. No poet praised its flavor. No lover served it at intimate meals. At best, it was an acquired taste. At worst, a necessary evil. But it was unforgettable. The tang lingered in the mouth, just as campaign memories lingered in the mind. For legionaries, Posca became part of daily rhythm. Bread in one hand, sour wine in the other, another mile ahead. The combination defined military existence, basic, repetitive, but engineered for endurance rather than pleasure. Posca's legacy extended beyond Rome. The principle that adding acidity to water improves safety influenced practices across cultures. Modern vinegar's preservation uses echo-ancient military necessity. That sharp taste taught civilizations how to survive when clean water wasn't guaranteed. Salted pork's role, grain provided foundation, and posca provided hydration, but salted pork supplied crucial protein. For Roman soldiers, preserved meat wasn't luxury, it was strategic necessity wrapped in brine. In the ancient world, meat spoiled rapidly. Without refrigeration, fresh pork would rot within days, especially under Mediterranean heat. But rubbed, packed, and cured with salt, it could last weeks or months. Legionaries carried slabs in their packs, sometimes boiling them in camp to soften the texture, other times roasting them on skewers when time allowed. The flavor was harsh, intensely salty, greasy, repetitive. But salted pork rebuilt muscles worn down by endless marching and brutal combat. Protein was the soldier's shield against exhaustion, one military historian noted. Without it, even the most disciplined army would collapse from physical depletion. Beyond nutrition, salted pork symbolized Roman logistical superiority. Supply officers ensured wagons rolled behind armies with barrels of preserved meat. Where other forces relied on foraging or looting locals, Romans built supply chains as dependable as their battle formations. The reliability meant Roman armies could campaign for extended periods without desperate supply situations. A hungry army might plunder once, but a well-fed legion could conquer for decades. This sustainability translated directly into military advantage. Still, soldiers didn't universally love their rations. Imagine chewing the same salty, greasy meat day after day. Warriors joked it was harder to swallow than facing barbarian charges. When possible, they improved it, mixing with lentils, soaking in vinegar, or seasoning with foraged herbs. On fortunate days, they traded portions with civilians for fresher cuts. But when nothing else was available, salted pork endured as stubbornly as the legionaries themselves. It reflected Roman military philosophy. Glory didn't come from comfort, but from enduring discomfort while still marching forward. Culturally, salted pork reinforced the image of Roman soldiers as hardy, practical men. No feasting, no indulgence, just salt, meat, and duty. It embodied the mindset that military success required accepting harsh conditions without complaint. Hard cheese's comfort. If salted pork was heavy burden, hard cheese was modest comfort. Dense, portable, surprisingly nutritious. Unlike soft cheeses that spoiled quickly, Romans relied on aged varieties, firm enough to survive weeks in a pack without crumbling. Hard cheese delivered fat and protein, balancing the grain-heavy diet. In a world where calories equaled survival, cheese was compact miracle. Soldiers could nibble it straight, crumble it over grain porridge, or melt it into stews to soften pork's harsh saltiness. A simple pot of boiling grain transformed into something hearty when a soldier tossed in cheese, releasing oils and flavor. For men who marched 30 kilometers daily and slept on hard ground, these small improvements mattered enormously. Food wasn't just fuel, it was morale. Cheese also symbolized Rome's agricultural backbone. Herding was common throughout Italy and the provinces. Supplying cheese to legions reminded soldiers of home. A piece of aged cheese might connect a legionary in distant Syria to memories of his father's farm in Latium. Such links made military life's drudgery bearable. The army prized cheese for durability across diverse climates. Grain could mold in damp weather. Pork could go rancid if improperly cured, but properly aged cheese endured rain, snow, and desert heat. This reliability made it a quiet cornerstone of military logistics. Quality varied with location, sometimes cow's milk, sometimes goats or sheep's, depending on what locals could be convinced or compelled to provide. The hardest varieties could nearly break teeth. Soldiers mockingly called it stone food. Yet even the toughest chunk of goat cheese was welcome after weeks of monotonous bread and vinegar. Cheese may not have the heroic image of weapons, but it served as quiet armor against hunger. It was food that survived campaigns alongside men enduring hardship with them. when fires burned low and soldiers chewed hardened rations. Cheese reminded them that Rome's strength involved not just conquest but humble, enduring provisions, keeping armies alive. Vinegar's versatility. To Roman soldiers, vinegar was more than an ingredient. It was a multi-purpose tool carried in small flasks or mixed into ubiquitous posca. It touched nearly every aspect of legionary life, from kitchen to battlefield infirmary. Practically, vinegar was preservation. Drenching meat or vegetables kept rot at bay, stretching rations beyond natural limits. Soldiers often soaked stale bread in vinegar and water to soften it, transforming tooth-breaking lumps into something chewable. It wasn't fine dining, but it meant fewer wasted supplies. Medicinally, vinegar was essential. Ancient Roman doctors, following Hippocratic and Galenic principles, saw vinegar as purifier. Soldiers used it to clean wounds, believing its sting warded off infection. In an age without antibiotics, this was lifeline. A cut on the march could fester into death. A splash of vinegar was the soldier's best defense. They gargled it for sore throats, dabbed it on insect bites, and sipped it diluted to ease stomach troubles. To weary legionaries, vinegar was both first aid and pharmacy. Psychologically, vinegar sharpened senses, a jolt to men dulled by fatigue. Imagine trudging through miles of dust and heat, then pausing to swig sour posca. The shock on the tongue was bracing, almost like a wake-up slap. Roman generals praised this austerity, contrasting it with enemies' indulgence. Legionaries joked about vinegar's punishing flavor, comparing it to drinking discipline, yet they consumed it anyway because it worked. Unlike wine, it didn't intoxicate. Unlike plain water, it didn't kill you. It was bitter, yes, but bitterness was part of the Roman way. Vinegar embodied Rome's military philosophy: simple, practical, effective. Not designed for comfort, but for endurance. As soldiers doused bread, cleaned wounds, or gulped sour mixtures by firelight, they proved that empire wasn't built on luxury, but on resilience, sharpened by vinegar's taste. The mobile kitchen Roman legionaries were more than fighters, they were mobile kitchens. Each man carried his own pantry and cookware strapped to a furca, a wooden pole slung over the shoulder like a yoke. Dangling from it hung a cooking pot, pan, and whatever supplies had been issued. To modern eyes, this looks like poor traveller's gear rather than soldiers' equipment. Yet this portable kitchen enabled Rome's legendary mobility. Unlike many ancient armies, Romans didn't rely entirely on baggage trains or civilian camp followers for cooking. Each soldier prepared his own meals, either alone or with his contubernium, the 8-man squad sharing a tent. At march's end, once camp walls and ditches were dug, the air filled with clattering pots and smoke from hundreds of fires. Bread baked on hot stones, pork boiled to soften its salt, cheese melted into stews. Within hours, an army of thousands became a sprawling outdoor kitchen. This system was genius for several reasons. First, it gave legions autonomy. If baggage trains were delayed or ambushed, soldiers could still feed themselves. Second, it built camaraderie. 8 men crammed into a tent, cooking and eating together each night, became brothers as much as comrades. The kitchen was source not just of food, but of loyalty. Of course, it wasn't pleasant. After 20 miles of marching, grinding flour and boiling pork wasn't anyone's idea of relaxation. Smoke stung eyes, bread burned, and more than one legionary probably cursed as his hard-earned meal toppled into dirt. But discipline demanded routine, and routine bred survival. Skipping the grindstone or fire risked weakness in the next day's battle. In a sense, the Roman soldier's kitchen reflected Rome itself: practical, rugged, relentlessly efficient. No banquets, no luxury, just fire, grain, and stubborn will to keep marching. As soldiers stirred pots under stars, surrounded by thousands, Doing the same, they carried not only their kitchens, but the very rhythm of Rome's empire on their backs. Marching rations. A Roman soldier's life was measured in miles, some days 20 kilometers, others 30, sometimes more if urgency demanded. Through it all, soldiers carried not just weapons and armor, but also sustenance, rations on the march. The legion wasn't followed by endless carts of delicacies. It was an army designed to feed itself, to move fast, and to endure. Mobility was Rome's greatest weapon, and food discipline made it possible. Standard ration packs included grain, pork, cheese, and vinegar. But soldiers couldn't always cook while moving. In those cases, grain was parched, roasted over quick flame to make it edible without grinding. It wasn't fine bread, but it kept hunger at bay. Hard cheese could be eaten straight, while strips of salted pork were gnawed like jerky. Sometimes bread was baked in advance and hardened into biscuits, dense and dry, perfect for chewing during marches. This was food stripped of ceremony, designed for endurance alone. The Roman army had a word for this discipline: frugalitas. They prided themselves on needing less than enemies. While barbarian warriors might feast one day and starve the next, legionaries kept steady, each man carrying several days' worth of provisions in his pack. This made them unpredictable and dangerous. They could appear suddenly in enemy territory, unchained from fragile supply wagons because their kitchens were on their shoulders. Marching rations shaped legion culture. Eating on the move became part of the soldier's rhythm: bite of bread, swig of posca, chew of pork. No luxury slowed them down. Even generals like Julius Caesar wrote about how his men could march faster and farther than rivals precisely because they knew how to ration properly. Hunger didn't stop them, discipline prevented it. Still, there were limits. When supplies ran low, men foraged. They plucked wild herbs, gathered fruits, or seized what they could from villages along the way. Some campaigns collapsed not from enemy swords, but from empty stomachs. For all Rome's logistics, the march was always a gamble. Too slow, men might eat through rations before the next resupply. Too fast, and exhaustion killed as surely as hunger. Yet more often than not, the Roman legion succeeded. The image of a soldier trudging along dusty roads, pack sagging with food, embodied Rome's secret weapon. Rations on the march weren't just survival, they were strategy. Victory, feasts. For days on end, legionaries' meals were predictable: grain, pork, cheese, and the sour bite of vinegar. But when victory came, food transformed from bare survival into celebration. The Roman feast after battle wasn't just about eating, it was about morale, reward, and reminding every soldier why enduring the monotony of rations was worthwhile. Feasting usually began when fighting ended and spoils were secured. Baggage animals kept safe during combat were slaughtered first. Fresh meat replaced salted slabs, filling the camp with the smell of roasting beef, lamb, or goat. Soldiers who had choked down dried rations on the march suddenly tore into sizzling cuts, juices dripping onto their tunics. Wine, real wine, not the diluted sourness of posca, was uncorked, passed around, and drunk with abandon. For a night, the army shed its austerity and revelled. These celebrations served deeper purposes. Victory feasts reinforced bonds of the contubernium and the legion as a whole. Sitting shoulder to shoulder around fires, men who had survived battle together now toasted one another. The simple act of eating transformed into ritual. Meat roasted over shared flames, bread broken and passed, laughter rising above embers. Even the most hardened centurion knew that food could heal what battle had broken. Commanders understood this too. Generals often distributed captured food as rewards, ensuring loyalty by filling bellies. A leader who shared spoils, whether grain from a conquered town or amphorae of wine from seized stores, secured his men's devotion. Soldiers would forgive many hardships if they knew victory promised feasting. The contrast was part of the magic. Hard bread and sour wine made fresh meat and real wine taste sweeter. Legionaries joked that Rome's empire was built not just on discipline, but on hope of a good feast after the killing stopped. These moments of indulgence were rare, but they lingered in memory, carried forward into the next grueling march. Yet even in celebration, moderation was expected. Discipline was never far from the table. Tomorrow might bring another battle, another march, and commanders feared drunkenness could undo what victory had secured. So the feasts, though joyous, were bounded by order. Romans celebrated not as revelers, but as soldiers who knew duty would soon call again. For one night, though, the campfire was brighter, the food richer, and the laughter louder. In those fleeting hours, victory tasted not of vinegar and salt, but of triumph itself. Food as strategy. When we think of Rome's conquests, we imagine gleaming swords, disciplined formations, and banners unfurled against foreign skies. Yet beneath the steel and spectacle lay something far more decisive: food. Rome's true weapon wasn't just the gladius, but the ability to feed its armies anywhere, anytime, for as long as needed. The empire wasn't built only on blood and stone, it was built on bread, pork, cheese, and vinegar. The genius of Roman logistics was that food was strategy. Legions didn't just fight, they carried the infrastructure of survival with them. Grain mills clattered in camp. Portable kitchens fired up every evening. Supply lines stretched like veins across conquered lands. Enemies who relied on plunder or feasting quickly collapsed when campaigns dragged on. Rome, by contrast, could starve its foes into submission, not because its soldiers ate better, but because they ate consistently. Predictability beat plenty. Food also acted as propaganda. A soldier might endure weeks of monotony, but he knew his ration was guaranteed. 3 pounds of grain, salted pork, a measure of cheese, and the sour security of posca. That guarantee created loyalty. Generals who provided food earned trust. Those who failed saw mutiny. Julius Caesar, Augustus, Trajan, all understood that feeding the soldier was feeding the empire itself. To march without fear of hunger gave Rome an advantage that no enemy could easily counter. Beyond the battlefield, rations tied soldiers to Roman identity. Eating the same simple diet day after day forged unity. A soldier from Gaul, another from Italy, another from Syria, might not share a language, but they shared bread from the same sack, pork from the same barrel, cheese hardened in the same sun. Food erased difference, shaping an army that thought of itself not as mercenaries but as Romans. Even centuries later, when the empire strained under its own weight, food remained central. Shortages and disrupted supply lines often spelled disaster more than any barbarian's spear. The collapse of Rome was as much about the breaking of its breadbasket as the breaking of its borders. So when we picture the legions, we should remember this truth. Rome conquered because it could eat. Grain was the empire's lifeblood, salted pork its muscle, cheese its comfort, and vinegar its shield. Together, they marched farther than any weapon could. The Roman legion wasn't just a war machine, it was a mobile kitchen, and its provisions were as mighty as its swords. Part 3. Saxon mead halls and community, the hearth's significance. To step inside a Saxon mead hall was to enter the community's heartbeat. From outside, these buildings seemed unremarkable, long wooden halls built from timber, roofs steeply thatched to shed rain. walls sealed against wind. But inside they transformed into something greater than wood and straw. At the center burned the hearth, a great fire that never seemed to die. Its flames cast dancing light across smoke-darkened beams, filling the hall with warmth, shadows, and the faint tang of ash. The hearth wasn't merely a fireplace, it was a symbol of life itself. In a world where winters were long and nights seemed endless, fire meant survival. But in the mead hall, it meant more. The hearth's glow drew people together, gathering warriors, lords, poets, and servants beneath one roof. It was here that communities found their strength, not on the battlefield or in fields, but around the warmth of firelight. At night, the hearth transformed the hall into a theatre of fellowship. Warriors returning from campaigns sat shoulder to shoulder with comrades, their mail glinting in the fire's glow. Their lord, seated at the high table, was illuminated not only by flame, but by the loyalty of those who pledged themselves to him. Around them the room buzzed with life. Dogs dozed near embers, servants carried platters of food, the scent of roasting meat mingled with the heavy sweetness of honeyed mead. The hall's design centered on the hearth. It was no accident that fire sat in the middle of the space. Every conversation, every feast, every song circled around it. The hearth bound the room together just as it bound the people within. A Saxon warrior might see the flames as reflection of his own life, fierce, fleeting, and sustained only by fuel. Without fire, the hall grew cold. Without loyalty, the community would falter. So when we speak of Saxon mead halls, we must first speak of their hearths. They were more than warmth against the chill. They were symbols of unity, loyalty, and endurance. In their glow, strangers became comrades, warriors became brothers, and a hall became a home. The ritual of feasting. The feast was the heartbeat of the Saxon mead hall. More than a simple meal, it was a ritual that blended survival with ceremony, binding warriors and kin together through the act of eating. When long tables were laid with roasted meats, steaming bowls of porridge and loaves of coarse bread, the mead hall became something more than shelter. It became the living symbol of unity. To feast in the hall was to be recognized. A warrior seated at the table had earned his place, whether through loyalty to his lord, valor in battle, or steadfast service to his kin. The distribution of food was never random. It was a subtle language of honor. A man given a generous cut of meat or a place closer to the lord's high table knew he was respected. In contrast, a lesser warrior or newcomer might find himself at the far end of benches, his portion smaller, his status uncertain. The feast was as much about reinforcing hierarchy as filling stomachs. Yet the mood of these gatherings was not cold or formal. The mead hall's atmosphere pulsed with life. The clatter of wooden trenchers, the snapping of bones, the laughter of comrades echoing beneath rafters, all of it gave the sense of belonging. Servants hurried between tables, pouring horn after horn of mead, ensuring the honey drink flowed as freely as conversation. With every shared dish and every refilled cup, trust deepened. The feast also served as a stage for loyalty. Lords were expected to be generous, rewarding their warriors with not only food, but gifts of gold rings, weapons, or finely woven cloaks. In return, warriors pledged their continued service. This exchange of generosity and loyalty created a cycle that kept Saxon society stable. A feast wasn't just about food, it was about politics, economy, and survival. And in the warmth of the hall, with bellies full and spirits lifted, the harsh realities of life, raids, famine, endless toil, seemed a little farther away. For one night, the hall was a world apart, a place of abundance in a land often defined by scarcity. In Saxon culture, to eat together was to live together. Each feast strengthened the invisible bonds between men and their lord, between families and their community. To be denied the feast was exile. To be welcomed at the table was life itself. Mead's meaning: if bread and meat filled the body, mead filled the spirit. To the Saxons, mead wasn't just a drink, it was liquid culture, the golden thread woven through every feast and gathering. Brewed from honey, water, and sometimes herbs or spices, mead carried with it the sweetness of summer fields and the labour of bees. In the mead hall, it became something greater, the drink of warriors, poets and kings. The act of drinking was never solitary. Horns and cups were passed down benches, each filled and refilled by servants who moved tirelessly through smoky air. To raise a horn of mead was to share not only a beverage, but a bond. It was the taste of loyalty, fellowship, and the fragile peace of men who lived with war always at their doorstep. Mead encouraged laughter, loosened tongues, and gave courage to those who needed it. Under its influence, warriors told stories, poets recited sagas, and lords made promises that could shape the fate of their people. But mead was more than a social lubricant. It carried symbolic weight. The honey it was made from was considered a gift of the gods, sacred and life-giving. Drinking mead was, in a sense, partaking in that divine blessing. It was thought to bring wisdom, fertility, and strength. No wonder poets compared it to liquid gold, and warriors believed it fueled not only their bodies, but their courage on the battlefield. The communal aspect of drinking also reinforced hierarchy. The lord often received the first and finest horn, served ceremoniously by the cupbearer, often a woman of noble standing. This act was more than hospitality, it was theatre. Every eye watched as the lord raised his drink, his authority shimmering in the firelight. When he drank, he confirmed his place as the hall's protector and provider. When his warriors followed, they silently renewed their oaths of loyalty. Of course, there was a darker side. Too much mead could loosen tempers as easily as tongues. Feasts that began in harmony sometimes ended in brawls, with spilled drink and blood mixing on the floor. But even this chaos was part of the mead hall's life, a reminder that fellowship was fragile, maintained by both generosity and restraint. In the end, mead was more than refreshment. It was memory in liquid form, a drink that captured loyalty, celebration, and the fleeting joy of life in a harsh world. To drink was to live, to remember, and to be remembered. The Lord's role. At the head of every mead hall sat its master, the Saxon lord or Hlaford, literally giver of bread. His role was more than political. It was symbolic, spiritual, and deeply practical. The mead hall existed because of him, yet he was defined by how he conducted himself within it. His authority rested not only on the strength of his sword, but on the generosity of his hand. When warriors gathered in the hall, all eyes turned toward the high seat. The lord was expected to preside over the feast, to welcome allies, and to dispense both food and gifts. Rings of gold, fine weapons, and cloaks woven with foreign dyes were not mere luxuries. They were the currency of loyalty. To give was to bind. Each gift was a silent contract. In return for generosity, the warrior owed service, courage, and unswerving loyalty in battle. This generosity was more than show. In a society where wealth came from land, cattle, and plunder, redistribution kept power stable. A greedy lord who hoarded treasures soon found himself without followers. A generous lord, by contrast, could transform even modest wealth into enduring loyalty. The mead hall was his stage, and every gesture, whether pouring the first horn of mead or offering a carved sword, was part of the drama of leadership. The lord was also the hall's protector. It was his duty to ensure that those who feasted beneath his roof were safe, that no enemy breached its doors, and that the hearth fire never went out. The hall's glow symbolized his strength. As long as it burned, his people knew they were secure. Stories recited by poets often praised lords not only for victories in war, but for the warmth and abundance they provided in the hall. Yet this role came with weight. A lord who failed to provide food, drink, or protection risked losing his warriors' loyalty. Betrayal in the hall could be as fatal as betrayal in battle. To preside poorly was to weaken the bonds that held the community together. In the end, the Saxon lord was as much a host as a warrior. His hall was not simply a dwelling, but a living symbol of his ability to give, protect, and lead. In the firelight, with warriors feasting at his table, his power was visible, not in isolation, but in the loyalty that surrounded him. Poets and memory. If the Lord was the anchor of the mead hall, then the poets were its voice. Known as scops or bards, these men carried more than songs, they carried memory itself. In a culture without books or written records, stories were the threads that bound past to present, ensuring that warriors' deeds did not vanish into silence. The mead hall, smoky and warm with firelight, became their stage. When a poet stood, horn in hand, the hall hushed. His words could transport warriors back to ancient battles, to the deeds of ancestors who fought giants, dragons, and rival kings. These weren't just tales, they were lessons. Through rhythm and rhyme, the scop taught loyalty, warned against betrayal, and praised the noble virtues of courage, generosity, and honor. A well-told saga was as important as any weapon, shaping how men saw themselves and their place in the world. Storytelling in the mead hall also elevated warriors to near immortality. A man might die in battle, but if the poet sang of his bravery, his name lived on, echoing through rafters for generations. To be forgotten was true death, to be remembered was glory. Warriors often fought not just for land or loot, but for the promise that the scop would one day sing of them beneath the glow of the hearth. The content of these performances ranged widely. Some were heroic epics recounting mighty battles. Others were elegies lamenting loss and life's fleeting nature. Still others carried humor or satire, poking fun at rivals or even lords who failed their duties. In every case, the poet wielded power. His tongue could praise or shame, build reputations or tear them down. Often music accompanied the poetry. A harp or lyre provided steady rhythm, underscoring the cadence of words. The hall became a symphony of crackling fire, murmuring warriors, and strings resonating beneath the voice of the bard. In these moments, the mead hall was not only a place of feasting, but of culture, a school without walls, a theatre without a stage. The poet's role was essential. He ensured that victories were remembered, defeats explained, and the values of the community reaffirmed. In the Saxon world, where memory was fragile and death always near, the voice of the storyteller was the closest thing to eternity. Oaths and loyalty. The Saxon mead hall was not only a place of feasting and storytelling, it was also a courtroom of loyalty where bonds between lord and warrior were forged and renewed. Here, under the gaze of firelight and with the taste of mead on their lips, men swore oaths that bound their lives to their leaders. These were not casual promises. In a world where treachery meant ruin, an oath in the hall was sacred, sealed before both comrades and gods. At the heart of this system was the comitatus, the warrior band. Each man pledged himself to his lord, promising courage in battle and faithfulness in peace. In return, the lord swore to provide protection, food, and reward. The mead hall gave this bond its stage. When a warrior lifted his horn and declared his loyalty, It was not just to the lord sitting at the high table, it was to every man in the hall who heard him. Breaking such an oath brought not only disgrace but exile. The rituals were steeped in symbolism. Warriors often swore with hands placed on weapons, invoking the steel they would wield for their lord. Some touched the communal mead horn as they spoke, linking their oath to the drink that united the hall. The presence of poets ensured these vows were remembered. A man who pledged boldly in the hall but failed to act bravely on the battlefield could expect to hear his cowardice sung of in mocking verse for years to come. Loyalty was also reciprocal. A good lord publicly acknowledged his men's oaths with gifts, rings, swords, shields, or cloaks. These were not bribes but symbols of trust, visible proof that the warrior was part of his lord's household. The more generous the lord, the stronger the loyalty he commanded. In this exchange, the mead hall became both courtroom and treasury, where promises were forged in drink, memory, and wealth. Yet the oaths went beyond politics, they bound lives together. A warrior's promise meant he would not abandon his comrades, even if death came. Tales told in the hall celebrated not only victories, but the steadfastness of men who died beside their lords rather than flee. Such stories reinforce the hall's central lesson. Loyalty was worth more than life. Thus, the Saxon mead hall was more than a place of warmth and mead. It was the crucible of trust, where words carried the weight of blood and oaths echoed louder than the crackling of the hearth fire. Women's presence. Though mead halls are often remembered as the domain of warriors and lords, women played a vital role within their smoky rafters. They were not merely background figures, their presence shaped the tone, ritual, and very meaning of the hall. The cupbearer, often the wife, daughter, or trusted kinswoman of the lord, was central to the life of the feast. Carrying the great horn of mead from man to man, she moved with dignity and care, ensuring each warrior drank in turn. This ritual was not simply about serving, it was about order, hierarchy, and respect. To receive the horn from her hands was to be recognized as part of the fellowship. Her role symbolized peace in a world dominated by violence. A woman's movement through the hall softened the edge of rivalry, reminding warriors that loyalty was as much about community as bloodshed. She embodied continuity, linking households together through marriage, kinship, and ritual. In many stories, the moment a queen or noblewoman presented the mead cup was when alliances were confirmed, oaths renewed, and tension dissolved. Her gestures carried political weight equal to any sword. Women were also keepers of memory. While male poets recited heroic deeds, women were often the mourners, their voices carrying laments that reminded men of the cost of war. Their songs, quieter but no less powerful, ensured that loss was remembered alongside victory. This duality, celebration from poets and sorrow from women, balanced the emotional life of the hall. Some women held influence beyond ritual. A powerful lady might act as counselor to her lord, whispering advice in private but reinforcing it in public through her ritual duties. Her presence in the hall reminded warriors that leadership was not solitary, it was sustained by household and kin. In this way, the mead hall became not just a fortress of warriors but the heart of an extended family. And of course, women were symbols of continuity. While warriors might die in foreign fields, women carried forward lineages, ensuring the survival of families and tribes. Their presence at the feast was a reminder that loyalty was not only to a lord, but to future generations. Thus, though the mead hall's songs often glorified the clash of swords, it was the quiet, steady presence of women, cupbearers, mourners, and counselors that gave the hall its deeper humanity. Without them, the fellowship of warriors risked becoming only noise and blood. Architecture and meaning. The Saxon mead hall was more than a roof overhead. It was architecture with meaning, built to embody belonging and power. From outside, the hall might appear simple. A long wooden building, its thatched roof pitched steeply against rain, smoke curling from gaps in the beams. But step inside, and its design revealed its true purpose: to gather, to unify, and to impress. The hall's shape was deliberate. Long and rectangular, with benches running down its length, it naturally directed all eyes toward the high seat at the far end. There, elevated above the rest, the Lord presided, the hearth fire's glow dancing across his face. This arrangement was no accident. It placed hierarchy into the very bones of the building. The physical space mirrored social order: lord at the head, warriors ranked along the sides, servants and newcomers toward the edges. Every plank and beam reinforced who belonged where. At the center burned the hearth, the hall's true heart, positioned so its smoke rose through the roof's opening. It lit and warmed the entire space. But it was more than practical. The hearth symbolized community itself, the fire around which people gathered, the light that pushed back darkness. No corner of the hall was untouched by its glow. To sit in its warmth was to be part of the whole. To be outside was to be forgotten. The architecture also amplified experience. High ceilings carried sound, making the clash of laughter, song, and poetry echo grandly. Rafters darkened by smoke became canvases for memory, each stain a reminder of years of feasting. Carved posts and decorated beams sometimes displayed patterns of beasts or knots, linking the structure to myth and tradition. The hall was not just built, it was inscribed with identity. Importantly, the mead hall was communal space, not private property. Unlike the lord's sleeping chamber or warrior's tent, it belonged to everyone who had earned a place within it. Its architecture invited participation: long tables for shared meals, benches for collective sitting, open space for poetry and storytelling. It was designed to erase isolation, to make each man feel part of a larger brotherhood. Thus the mead hall was not only timber and thatch, it was a building that spoke. Its walls reminded warriors of loyalty, its hearth of unity, its high seat of authority. To cross its threshold was to step into belonging, to know one's place within a community bound by firelight and fellowship. Seasonal festivals for the Saxons. Time was not measured in neat rows of ink on parchment, but in the steady heartbeat of the natural world. The rise of the sun, the fall of the moon, the greening of fields and the withering of leaves all told them what calendars could not. Life was bound to cycles of sowing and harvest, of cold and warmth, of hunger and plenty. And at each crucial moment of these cycles, the Saxons gathered in ritual and feast, marking their place in the great wheel of the year. These gatherings were not frivolous distractions from hard work. They were the glue that bound community together. In a world without certainty, festivals gave rhythm and reassurance. The harsh winter nights, when frost gnawed at doors and the sun seemed reluctant to return, were answered by blazing fires and shared mead. The restless days of spring, when fields demanded planting and warriors sharpened their spears, were marked by rites that blessed fertility and promised renewal. Even harvest itself, exhausting as it was, ended in celebration, a reminder that toil bore fruit and the community would endure another year. Religion lay at the heart of these cycles. Pagan gods and ancestral spirits were honored at feasts with offerings of grain, meat, and drink. Fires symbolized the rebirth of the sun, while songs carried prayers for good fortune and safety in battle. To participate in a festival was to participate in the sacred order of things, a reminder that man's work on earth was tied to forces greater than himself. Yet these events were not all solemnity. They were also occasions of joy, laughter, and abundance in lives that were otherwise marked by hardship. Tables filled with roasted meats, horns of mead passed from hand to hand, and music echoed through halls. People sang, danced, and told stories that stitched the community together. The festival was a rare moment when hunger gave way to plenty, fear to hope, isolation to belonging. For the Saxons, then, the year was not a straight line, but a circle. Each festival turned the wheel, marking both an ending and a beginning. Through fire, food, and fellowship, the Saxons not only survived the seasons, they gave them meaning. Yule's defiance. When winter pressed hardest, when the nights stretched long and the earth seemed lifeless, the Saxons turned to Yule. This midwinter festival was more than a holiday. It was an act of defiance against the cold and dark. The people lit great bonfires, some in open fields, others in the hearths of mead halls, flames leaping high as if to call back the sun itself. Fire was not just warmth, it was a promise, a living symbol that light would return and that life had not been abandoned by the gods. Yule was marked by abundance, though it came in the leanest time of year. Families gathered in halls heavy with the smell of roasting meats, pork, venison, or whatever the hunters could bring in. Bread was baked, ale brewed, and most importantly, the drinking horns of mead flowed without end. The sharing of food and drink in such difficult months was no small thing. It reinforced solidarity. No one faced the long night alone. If your lord filled your plate and horn at Yule, he was not just feeding you, he was proving his worth as a provider, the one who could lead you safely through scarcity. The religious element was inseparable. Yule fires honored the gods and spirits of the ancestors, calling for protection through the dangerous winter months. Offerings of food and drink were cast into the flames, smoke rising as a bridge between the mortal and the divine. Warriors often used this time to boast of past deeds or swear new oaths, the fire itself serving as witness to their pledges. Just as the sun would return after its darkest hour, so too would loyalty endure after the trials of war. It was also a time of inversion, when the ordinary rules of life relaxed. Stories tell of games, contests, and mischief, with laughter filling the smoke-filled halls. Yule was not merely a pause from hardship, it was a celebration of survival. Children received gifts carved from wood or bone, tokens of joy to brighten the darkest season. Above all, Yule reminded the Saxons that even in the depth of winter, life still pulsed, fire blazed, drink warmed, and fellowship held firm. In that glow they saw not only the end of one year, but the birth of another, a cycle unbroken. Spring and renewal. If Yule was about survival in the dark, spring festivals were about renewal in the light. As the frost loosened its grip and the first shoots broke through the soil, the Saxons turned to rituals of fertility, celebrations that honored the earth's awakening and called upon the gods to bless fields, herds, and families with abundance. In a world where one failed harvest could mean starvation, these rites were not quaint superstition, they were urgent acts of hope. The season's rituals often centered on the goddess Eostre, whose name lingers in our word, Easter. She was associated with dawn, rebirth, and fertility. Her symbols tied to hares, eggs, and the returning sun. Offerings of bread, milk, and honey were made in her honor, placed on altars or buried in the earth as gifts to ensure the land's generosity. Fires were lit at dawn, their smoke curling skyward like prayers for good harvests. Communal feasting was an essential part of these spring rites. Fresh lamb and early greens often marked the tables, along with the last reserves of stored grain. Eating together symbolized shared renewal. The community would not only survive the winter, but flourish in the year ahead. Mead horns circulated and songs filled the air, many of them celebrating fertility not only in fields but in families. Weddings and betrothals often coincided with these festivals, binding human unions to the earth's own cycles of rebirth. The rites themselves could be playful as well as sacred. Young men and women participated in games that carried symbolic meaning, races, dances, and contests of strength that mirrored the vigor of new life. Some traditions involved scattering ashes or blessing fields with fire and water, rituals meant to cleanse and fertilize the soil. Every act, whether solemn or spirited, carried the same message: life returns, and with it the promise of abundance. For warriors, spring rites had their own weight. The season marked the start of campaigning, when roads and fields were clear enough for armies to move. Oaths taken during fertility rites bound warriors to their lords as firmly as the ploughs bound farmers to their soil. Thus, spring was both a season of crops and of conflict, its rituals shaping not just the year's food, but the year's battles. Spring fertility festivals reminded the Saxons that life was fragile, yet resilient. Every seed sown was an act of faith, every rite a declaration that death and darkness would not have the final word. Harvest gratitude. If spring was about hope and sowing, the harvest festival was about proof and reward. After months of toil in the fields, ploughing, sowing, weeding, and praying, the Saxons marked the season of reaping with one of their most important celebrations. The harvest feast was both thanksgiving and survival strategy, a moment when the community could finally see the fruits of their labor piled high before them. The timing varied with the crops, but late summer and early autumn were the busiest months. Barley, oats, wheat, and rye were gathered, along with fruits from orchards, and whatever livestock could be culled for winter stores. Fields that had once been bare now yielded bounty, and the mead hall tables groaned with roasted meats, loaves of fresh bread, and bowls of grain porridge made from the new harvest. Ale brewed from fresh barley and honey-rich mead marked the occasion with drink as golden as the fields themselves. But the feast was not only about filling bellies, it was steeped in ritual. The first sheaf of grain was often dedicated to the gods, sometimes set aside in a place of honor or burned as an offering. This act symbolized gratitude and acknowledged that abundance came not by human hands alone, but by divine favor. The harvest feast was as much about appeasing unseen powers as enjoying visible bounty. The celebration also reinforced community bonds. Everyone from lords and warriors to farmers, craftsmen, and children shared in the feast. For one night, differences of rank softened, replaced by the shared relief that the stores were full and the winter would be endured. Songs praised not only the gods but the labor of men and women who had bent their backs in the fields. Dances often followed, their steps echoing the rhythms of planting and reaping, turning hard labor into art. For the Lord, the harvest feast was a moment of generosity. To distribute food and drink freely was to prove his role as protector and provider. To withhold would be shameful. Abundance was expected. Gifts might even be given, tokens of gratitude for loyal service during the hard months. The harvest feast was not only a marker of survival, it was a declaration of continuity. Each year's bounty carried the promise of another cycle, another turning of the great wheel of seasons. In a land where famine always lurked, this festival was both relief and renewal, a reminder that toil and faith could indeed bring reward. Victory and warfare. Feasts, not all Saxon feasts, were tied to the soil. Some were born of blood and steel. When war bands returned from raids or campaigns, victorious or merely surviving, the mead hall became the stage for their triumph. These were not quiet suppers, but roaring victory feasts where warriors' deeds were praised, loot was divided, and loyalty between lord and men was reaffirmed in food, drink, and ritual. The feast often began with display. Weapons taken from enemies, captured banners, or exotic goods from distant lands were paraded before the gathered crowd. Warriors seated at the benches waited for their share, sometimes silver, sometimes livestock, sometimes even slaves or jewelry. Yet the greatest rewards were often symbolic. A lord presenting a warrior with a new sword or ring in front of his peers was publicly honoring him, enshrining his courage in memory. Food and drink flowed as freely as the boasting. Roasted meats, sometimes the spoils of the raid itself, were piled high, and horns of mead were never empty. The atmosphere was electric, filled with laughter, song, and the inevitable contests of words. Warriors would boast of their victories, sometimes truthfully, sometimes with exaggeration, while poets recorded their words in song. These boasts were not idle bragging. They were a kind of currency, a way to establish honor and demand recognition. The victory feast was also a political act. By distributing spoils, the lord proved his generosity. By rewarding bravery, he secured loyalty. A lord who was stingy or forgetful during such a feast risked losing the respect of his warriors, perhaps even their service. In contrast, a generous feast could ensure loyalty for years. It was no accident that lords often planned the most lavish celebrations after successful campaigns. These feasts also carried ritual weight. Oaths of loyalty might be renewed, sometimes dramatically, with warriors swearing on their weapons or raising their horns in solemn pledges. The poet's verses immortalized these moments, ensuring that glory would not fade with the dying fire. For the Saxons, victory feasts transformed violence into order. Bloodshed outside became fellowship inside. The mead hall turned the chaos of war into the structure of loyalty, weaving courage into community through fire, food, and story. Sacred offerings. For the Saxons, feasting was never only about survival or celebration. It was also sacred. At certain times of the year, food and drink became offerings, bridging the human world with the divine. Religious sacrifice and sacred feasting tied the community not only to one another, but to their gods, ancestors, and the unseen forces that governed fate. The most common sacrifices were animals. Cattle, sheep, or swine were offered during great festivals, their blood spilled as a gift to the gods of harvest, war, or fertility. The act was solemn, often accompanied by prayers, chants, or the lighting of ritual fires. Yet the sacrifice was not wasteful. After the gods were honored, the meat was roasted and shared among the people. This practice blurred the line between offering and feast. To eat the sacrificed animal was to take part in the blessing, to consume both nourishment and divine favor. These sacred feasts often took place in the mead hall, but sometimes they were held outdoors at sacred groves or stone sites. Fires were lit, food prepared, and horns of mead raised in toasts to deities such as Woden, Thuna, or Frigg. Each toast was both prayer and promise, asking for protection in war, fertility for the fields, or good fortune for the coming season. In this way, every bite and every sip became an act of devotion. The role of the Lord during these feasts was crucial. He acted as both host and priest, guiding the rituals and ensuring the offerings were made correctly. His ability to connect his people with the divine reinforced his authority. A lord who led the feast well showed not only generosity but spiritual power. His rule was sanctified by fire, food, and the gods themselves. Yet these occasions were not only solemn. Sacred feasts were also communal celebrations. After the sacrifices were made, the atmosphere often shifted to joy. Music swelled, storytellers performed, and the people feasted deep into the night. For the Saxons, piety and pleasure were not opposites, they were partners. To honor the gods was to celebrate life, and to celebrate life was to honor the gods. Religious sacrifice and sacred feasting reminded the Saxons that survival was never a human achievement alone. The gods provided, the ancestors watched, and the people responded with gratitude, offerings, and joy. In those moments, the line between the mortal and the divine blurred, and the hall glowed with more than firelight. It glowed with blessing. Games and entertainment. No Saxon festival was complete without entertainment. Once the sacrifices were made, the feasting done, and the mead flowing, the mead hall or village green transformed into a stage of laughter, competition, and music. Games, music, and merriment were more than diversions. They were rituals of joy, a way to bind communities through play as much as through prayer. The games varied with the season. In spring and summer, when weather allowed, athletic contests dominated. Wrestling matches tested strength, while spear throwing and archery displayed martial skill. Young warriors proved themselves before their elders, earning admiration and sometimes mockery if they fell short. These contests were not idle sport but training for battle disguised as entertainment. Victory brought prestige and losing built resilience. The community watched, cheered, and remembered. Winter games were often played indoors within the warmth of the hall. Dice, knucklebones, and board games such as taffle filled the long nights, their clatter echoing beneath the rafters. These games mixed chance with strategy, echoing the Saxon view of life. Fate ruled all, but skill still mattered. Laughter and groans at the fall of dice reminded everyone that luck was as much a player as any man. Music carried equal weight. Harps, lyres, and drums provided rhythm for songs that could stir hearts or soothe weary souls. Skilled musicians could lift the hall into a frenzy or silence it into reverence. Poets and bards recited tales of gods, kings, and heroes, weaving entertainment with cultural memory. To hear one's ancestors honored in verse was as sweet as mead, and to have one's own deeds sung was to taste immortality. Dance, too, filled the spaces between contests and song. Men and women moved in circles, stamping feet and clapping hands, their motions echoing the cycles of nature and the rhythm of community. Children ran between the dancers, mimicking their steps, already learning the traditions that would one day be theirs to keep alive. But perhaps the greatest merriment was simply the laughter. Festivals allowed space for humor, for jesters and fools to mock even the highest lord, their antics tolerated in the spirit of release. In a world of hard work, hunger, and danger, these moments of levity were essential. They reminded the Saxons that life was not only duty and survival, but also joy. Through games, music, and merriment, festivals balanced the sacred with the playful. They turned survival into celebration, making the bonds of fellowship stronger with every laugh, song, and contest. The turning wheel for the Saxons, festivals were not isolated events but markers on the great wheel of the year. Each celebration announced a turning point in the cycle of nature, guiding people through darkness and light, scarcity and abundance. Unlike our modern calendars, where dates are abstract numbers, the Saxons lived by rhythms they could see and feel, the thaw of the earth, the height of the sun, the shortening of days. Every feast was both an ending and a beginning. Winter ended with Yule, when fire and mead pushed back the cold and called for the return of light. From there, the cycle turned towards spring fertility rites, which celebrated planting, rebirth, and hope. These were not just rituals of survival, but statements of faith that seeds buried in the soil would rise, that life would outlast death, that the gods would not abandon their people. Summer brought its own gatherings, often tied to midsummer fires. These flames honored the longest day of the year, a reminder of the sun's power and a plea that it lingered long enough to ripen crops. Summer festivals were times of strength, when warriors prepared for raids and fields brimmed with promise. Then came autumn, the season of harvest, when the feast tables overflowed and relief spread through every household. The turning of the seasons was not only agricultural, but spiritual. Each shift reminded the Saxons of Weird, the concept of fate. Just as the seasons could not be stopped, so too were human lives bound to a greater order. Festivals gave people a chance to accept that fate, to honor the cycles that ruled them, and to find comfort in their predictability. Communities experienced these changes together. A poor harvest was everyone's hardship, a successful one everyone's joy. Festivals made the turning of the seasons communal rather than solitary, binding families and clans in the shared acknowledgement that they were subject to the same sun, the same soil, the same gods. In this way, the mead hall fire was more than warmth, the feast more than food, the song more than entertainment. Each celebration was a ritual of transition, a way of walking through the doors of time together. The Saxons did not just observe the turning of the seasons, they lived inside it, their lives as cyclical as the festivals that marked them. Enduring legacy. Though the smoke of their hearths has long since drifted away, the spirit of Saxon festivals still lingers in the traditions we recognize today. What began as communal fires in wooden halls and offerings of mead to the gods left echoes in later medieval feasts, church holidays, and even the rhythms of our modern calendar. The Saxons may be gone, but their cycle of celebration remains woven into culture. Take Yule, for example. Its fires and feasts survive in Christmas traditions. The blazing hearth, the Yule log, the gathering of families around food and drink during the darkest days of winter. Spring fertility rites, once dedicated to the goddess Eostre, gave their name to Easter, where eggs and hares still symbolize renewal. Even the harvest festival, once steeped in pagan offerings, finds its reflection in harvest thanksgivings and autumn feasts that mark the turning of the year. The Saxons also passed down the idea that community is built around shared ritual. Festivals were not luxuries for them, they were necessities. A man who feasted with his kin was part of the circle, bound by loyalty and memory. To be excluded was to be cast adrift. That sense of belonging through shared meals and song resonates even now. Family dinners, seasonal gatherings, and national holidays all carry the same purpose, to remind people that they are part of something larger than themselves. Their legacy also lives in the tension between the sacred and the joyous. For the Saxons, no feast was purely religious or purely entertaining. It was always both. Sacrifice might be followed by song, solemn prayer by laughter. We too inherit that balance. Celebrations today mix ritual with merriment, ceremony with festivity. Perhaps the greatest legacy of Saxon feasting is its resilience. It proved that in a world often harsh and uncertain, people found ways to affirm life. Fire could chase away darkness, food could soften hunger, and fellowship could outlast fear. These truths are timeless. So when we sit at a holiday table, raise a glass in celebration, or gather around a fire, we unconsciously echo the Saxons. Their festivals and feasts taught that survival was not enough. To live fully meant to celebrate, to remember, and to belong. And in that sense, their legacy still burns as brightly as any Yule fire. Conclusion. Threads through time. We have journeyed through 3 distinct yet interconnected stories of human civilization. The Colosseum's transformation from imperial spectacle to scattered stone teaches us about impermanence and the complex relationship between past and present. Roman military provisions remind us that empires are built not just on glory but on the mundane logistics of feeding armies, and Saxon mead halls reveal how communities create meaning through ritual, gathering, and shared experience. Each story carries its own lessons. The Colosseum shows how even the mightiest monuments are vulnerable to time, nature, and human pragmatism. What seemed eternal proved temporary. What appeared indestructible was dismantled piece by piece across centuries. Yet the structure endures as a fragment, teaching us that preservation matters and that cultural memory requires active care. The Roman legions demonstrate that practical considerations often trump dramatic narratives. Grain, vinegar, and salted pork conquered more territory than swords alone. Logistics won campaigns. Supply chains determined outcomes. The lesson resonates today. Success in any endeavor requires attention to fundamental needs before pursuing spectacular achievements. Saxon mead halls illustrate how humans create belonging through ritual and repetition. The hearth's glow, the passing of the mead horn, the poet's voice. These weren't luxuries, but necessities that bound communities together. In our modern world of digital connection and physical isolation, the Saxon model reminds us that genuine fellowship requires shared physical presence, shared ritual, and shared story. These 3 narratives span different eras and cultures, yet they share common threads. They all concern how humans build, sustain, and remember. They explore the tension between permanence and change, between individual need and communal good, between practical survival and meaningful existence. They remind us that history isn't just dates and battles, it's the daily rhythms of life, the choices made about what to preserve and what to abandon, the ways people find meaning in harsh circumstances. As we close this journey, consider what these stories reveal about our own time. We too build monuments that we assume will last forever. We too must solve the logistics of feeding and sustaining large populations. We too seek communities that provide belonging and meaning. The past doesn't simply vanish, it echoes forward, shaping how we understand ourselves and our place in the ongoing human story. The Colosseum stones may be scattered, but they still teach. The Roman soldiers' rations may be long consumed, but the principles endure. The Saxon mead halls may be dust, but their fires still warm us across the centuries. History is not dead, it lives in every choice we make about what to preserve, how to organize our societies, and where we find fellowship. These ancient voices still speak if we're willing to listen.